Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about Ironman records today, in that I am old enough that I have watched almost all of the records on this board, with the exception of Gary Unger. I didn't get to see Gary Unger play, but anybody else on the board, I did. So Phil Kessel, of course, took his place. He has played 990 consecutive games. It'll be 991 tonight when they're at home against the Anaheim Ducks. And so for Kessel, it's been quite the career. But one thing that gets mentioned about Ironman records, and I think it's because the term's Ironman, which is strong, and toughness is, yeah, but is he really tough? And that's a question that's been asked going all the way back to the reason why I'm wearing a Whalers jersey. So for Phil Kessel, 990 games played in a row. He's played 1,212 games altogether, 400 goals, 559 assists, 959 points. He has 376 penalty minutes. Penalty minutes, not really an indicator necessarily of toughness, but they'll tell you, who ends up in the sin bin the most. And most of the guys on this board have been pretty well-behaved players. These are guys who've kept their nose clean, played a very long time. So he replaced Keith Yandle as the Ironman. Keith Yandle, of course, is now retired, played 989 straight games. The one thing is, I know people were frustrated that Philadelphia made him a healthy scratch, but Kessel's going to pass whatever record he would have had anyways. 1,109 games played altogether for Yandle, 103 goals, 516 assists, 619 points. 293 career penalty minutes. Now, it was at least a year prior to that consecutive games mark being ended by Philadelphia that there were discussions about whether or not Coach Joel Quenneville wanted to end it in Florida, whether he wanted to rest him. And that the consecutive games mark may have been part of the reason why he was traded last year, in that if he's not going to get to play every single night, you might as well move him. So for Yandle, it's been really interesting to see how that ended and all of that stuff. And again, I understand people were upset with how it ended, but I also understood kind of sort of where Philadelphia was coming from. It's just it was in the midst of a disastrous season, so it was the cherry on top of what was a disastrous Sunday. But Yandle replaced Doug Jarvis. 964 straight games played by Jarvis, and that's all he played in his career. He never missed a game his entire career. He's the only one on the board that could say that. 139 goals, 264 assists, 403 points, 263 penalty minutes. The argument at the time that he set the games played record, believe he was playing in Hartford at the time, was that he was a softer player than the guy he was replacing, and therefore he was less of a player than the man he was replacing. I can kind of understand this argument, but the reality is if you play 964 straight games, you're doing something right. But the question gets asked, does he end up being a Hartford Whaler later in his career? Because you can't bench him. You can't take him out of the game. He's the Ironman. And I remember, too, I had the Hockey News issue that had Doug Jarvis standing next to a set of Knights armor to kind of, Ironman representation go. But again, because of that strong man kind of feeling to it, people would look and go, well, Doug Jarvis isn't an Iron Man, and yet he played 964 straight games. Now, the one he replaced is the one that might be the toughest guy on the board. 914 straight games played by Gary Unger. Out of 1,105 games played in his career, 413 goals, 391 assists, 804 points. And penalty minutes, 1,075. So Gary Unger was not shy. Gary Unger was a guy who was willing to drop the gloves. Might be the only one on the board. I'm just looking up and down this board and saying, yeah, these guys haven't exactly been known for being fighters, right? Big hitters, that kind of thing. Gary Unger was able to do both. And Unger recorded 400 goals in his career. Remarkable run, 914 games. And again, there were those that felt like the guys who took over from him weren't as tough as he was, but that's not really the measure of the Ironman. It's just the consecutive games. Patrick Marleau, of course, was on an active streak at the time that his career ended, 910 games played in a row, out of a career of 1,779 games. Just amazing conditioning by Marleau to be able to play for that long and to that age. 566 goals, 631 assists for 1,179 points. 527 penalty minutes in his career. And so the argument can be made with Marleau as well. He's a soft player and he didn't play those hard minutes, but he played a lot. And he was really a prime go-to guy for the San Jose Sharks for a very long time, and he managed to stay healthy. Now, next on the list is Steve Larmer, who his mark would have been a more than 884 games. He ended his own consecutive game streak. He wanted out of Chicago, and if that meant he lost out on his consecutive game streak, oh well. 1,006 games played in his career, 441 goals, 571 assists, 1,012 points. I mentioned his career video, I'll say it here, a very underrated player in his time. 532 penalty minutes. Larmer wasn't a guy who necessarily fought, but he wasn't the guy who shied away from physical action either. 532 penalty minutes would tell you, yeah, I mean, he has 5 more penalty minutes than Marleau and played almost 800 less games. So, yeah, I mean, Larmer was a guy who would play the physical game. He was a good checking center, good leader. I believe he was captain for a portion of his career there as well. Very solid player. So for me, Unger and Larmer would probably be the toughest 2 guys on the board. That being said, Cogliano at 830, and we know how his game streak ended. The NHL suspended him. It was not a popular move at the time, nor is it a popular move now, so I'm not going to mention it in this video. 1,147 games played by Cogliano in his career. 175 goals, 254 assists, 429 points, 393 penalty minutes. Cogliano's not a dirty player, and it is odd that his consecutive game streak was ended by a suspension. That again, I'm not going to mention it here. It's a minefield if you mention it. So just stay away from it, don't mention it, and move on. But yeah, Cogliano, solid bottom 6 forward through most of his career, and amazing long run he went on there. Craig Ramsay, 776 games played with Buffalo, all in a row. 1,070 games played altogether, all in Buffalo. 252 goals, 420 assists, 672 points. Only 201 penalty minutes in his career. Craig Ramsay was a very gentlemanly player. He didn't shy away from the physical action either, but he was a gentlemanly player that he didn't take penalties. And he was a good checking center as far as I remember from the early 80s when I watched him. But I was young, so I didn't watch a ton of Buffalo games. But I remember I liked Craig Ramsay. I liked Mike Ramsay as well, even though they were spelled different. Not related, obviously, spelled different and all. But yeah, solid player, solid third line, fourth line center at points in his career as well towards the end. Jay Bouwmeester, 737 straight games played by Bouwmeester, out of a career of 1,240 games, 88 goals, 336 assists, 424 points, 635 penalty minutes, and definitely a tough player as well when he needed to be. The interesting thing, too, with Jay Bouwmeester is that he went through parts of his career where he seen as overrated, seen as underrated. But Bouwmeester put together a very solid career. Wish him the best in retirement. And number 9 on the board, sadly not higher. Brent Burns is the only other active player on the board, and at 685 games, that's where his active games played streak is, he's the only other player in the NHL who's above 500 games. So we'll talk about him, and then we'll talk about why I don't think anybody ever challenges Kessel. 1,257 games played by Burns, 227 goals, 554 assists for 781 points, 767 penalty minutes for Burns. Burns can drop the gloves if he needs to. Not that he does very often, but he can. So Burns, capable and a physical player, but again, Ironman doesn't mean toughness as much as it means being able to play X amount of games in a row without missing any, which does have a certain amount of toughness to it. Can't be easy to get up for 990 straight games. Maybe part of the reason that Kessel's able to do this is because he's more casual with the workout regimen than his peers. Maybe he's avoided some of the injuries others get because he does take it a little easier than other players. So for Phil Kessel, it's been great, but I don't think anybody ever challenges Kessel for one specific, well, there's 2 specific reasons. The obvious one to me is, how often do we see a guy being held out of the lineup as a healthy scratch as a precaution? So he's not healthy, but he's not that injured either. Yeah, you could play him, but we're going to hold him out as a precaution. How often do we see players rested before the playoffs? We've got 2 games left before the playoffs. We're going to pull these guys out of the lineup, and we're going to let him rest up for the first round. We don't see players playing 82 games as much as we used to. It used to be relatively common to see, back in the 80-game schedule in the 80s, see a bunch of players with 80 games played, and it just doesn't feel like we see that in the NHL now. You might see a team where nobody plays 82 games. Maybe one, maybe two players play 82 games. So the odds of a player getting on a run like this, it drops substantially. And we are definitely in an age where you're far more likely to see players not playing. We see players leaving the lineup for personal reasons, whether it's going to be with their wife at the time she has the baby, whether it's they need a mental break from the game, they're going through their own issues at the time. These are things that, again, we didn't really see back in the day when a lot of these guys were setting these records. I don't remember guys leaving to be with their wives when they had kids back in the 80s. I don't remember. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means I don't remember it. But it is a different age we live in now, and I don't think anybody gets close to 990 games played. I think that consecutive games record is as safe as it can be. I would be because again, nobody outside of Burns even has 500 games played in a row on the active list. And Burns, I can't see him playing another 4 years to reach Kessel. And Kessel's mark would have to end sometime soon for Burns to be able to get to it. So Kessel will reach over 1,000 games played consecutively, and I don't think anybody ever touches that mark. It's part of the reason I'm doing a video now on it, because I think this is one of those records that's going to stand the test of time. But let me know your thoughts. If you think there's somebody in the NHL who can and will approach this record, let me know your thoughts on that. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.